So we submitted our renewal proposal in March for the next 4 years of funding, and we're hoping to have a site review next year. So this is, what I want to do is first give a little context before I talk about what I think is new and exciting. So this is the previous conceptual view of really many of the systems in the Southwest and certainly for the Chihuahuan Desert systems. The map up in the right-hand corner is, whoops, I can go back one, I can't. Well, the idea is that it's all sort of blocky. We always look at things Chihuahuan grasslands and shrublands. And so we've always sort of graphed things, I'll show it in a minute, in terms of sort of upland grasslands and Chihuahuan and creosote bush and mesquite. And so our system's always, we've always sort of skipped those separate. And now what we're doing is we've, in our most recent proposal, is we're looking at things as a continuous landscape. And that gives us much more way to look at semi-arid systems across the globe. So we now look at, I don't want to touch the screen, but our landscapes now it's a continuous and very heterogeneous landscape. And so we look at thresholds and crust-hill interactions across this landscape. And our drivers and things that trigger sort of changes. You've typically thought of the Jornada as a desertification system, but we think about lots of different kinds of alternative states. And I'll talk a minute about how we're sort of shifting our system back from a shrub-dominated towards a grassland-dominated state again. But also we have sort of shift between types of shrub-dominated systems and also towards novel ecosystems. We have sort of exotic grasses coming into our system, much like they have in the Sonoran Desert. So this is a new way of looking at the system instead of sort of blocky view, which I have in my next slide, which is up in the right-hand corner. That's the old view of our landscape where everyone sort of studied either the sandy sort of mesquite-dominated system or the grassland system or the creosote system. And then they had these sort of figures where they kept everything separate. But now we're sort of going to this heterogeneous sort of landscape. Well, this had consequences also for our information management system, where we had to sort of, previously we sort of kept everything coded that way, and everything was sort of separated. Well, now as we're going to this heterogeneous sort of landscape, we have to look for variables that allow us to put all these different ecosystem types on the same graph. And so in the bottom right-hand corner, now we have to look for things like soil moisture, soil properties, species richness, that allow us to put all of these different ecosystem types together in the same figure. And I think that actually provides a lot of power for us because now we can compare these different ecosystem types on the same figure. But it does have a lot of consequences for our data management system. And now we're moving away from sort of a traditional information management system to what we call a data science integrated system. And it's a real challenge for us then to actually integrate all of our studies, which have traditionally been very separate and driven by our PIs, into sort of one data management system that's actually very integrated. So let me give you an example. So this is up in the top left-hand side. This is growing season precipitation through time. This is one of the first LTER data sets that was collected in 1988, actually. And then we have corresponding primary production data at 15 locations that Laura Hunicke set up. Started in '88, and now we've continued that. So this is a primary production study, but if you look at the precipitation data, it's very interesting. So from '88 to 2003, it sort of bounced around. We called it our baseline period. And then we had a period of wet years from 2004 to 2009, and very, very pulsy. So 3 years that were just huge amounts of precipitation. And then a post-wet period that was actually very similar to the baseline. And then the more recent period that's a little above precipitation. And so those actually, that we think of those as 4 different periods, and they were actually analyzing separately. And so in our traditional way, which I think actually it turns out this in sort of looking at the local, it's very useful still to look at these 4 different, I've taken out our playas because they have run out of water, but it's very useful still to look at these 4 different types of ecosystems separate for these periods. And you can see that the amount of precipitation and also production then vary for these different types of periods. And you can see how they're looking like through time. That wet period was actually just a huge pulse and had a legacy effect in each of these different types of systems, but the amount is different. And what's really interesting is we look at the grassland, that the legacy effect actually is continuing to present day, which is quite interesting, and not so much in some of the other ecosystems. But our mesquite was basically no perennial grasses at all going into that legacy, going into that long-term wet period. And now we still have perennial grasses in our mesquite, which is quite interesting. If you've been to the Jornada, sort of that mesquite sort of moonscape, we actually have perennial grasses still growing in our mesquite systems, which is quite interesting. And the same is for our tar bush. So our new approach now is we put all these on one axis, right? And so our baseline period was pretty much a mix. This is species composition. This is a PCA. And so they actually had similar species composition, some separation. We can follow them through the wet period. There's sort of some just sort of transitional period, then the post-wet. And now look at how they've sort of separated out. Our 3 grassland sites are the red. They actually have different species composition. The purple are the 3 tarbush sites. They have 3 different species composition. And the creosote and the mesquite actually have similar species composition, which is all quite interesting for us and quite a different way for us to look at the systems. And we think of this sort of wet period as sort of what it might look like in the future if it gets wetter. What the post-wet is a dry period actually for us, and what that might actually look like if it gets drier, when it's predicted to get drier. So I think we can use these as sort of ways to pretend what it might look like in the future under different sort of climate scenarios. So I think it's a very powerful way for us to now look at the landscape as a heterogeneous sort of continuous surface instead of the sort of blocky way that we've looked at it for many, many years.